as you know, we have the younger generation.
What means younger?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he doesn't look too young,
Yeah.
but certainly younger than
I have
me.
seen younger than this.
Yeah. No, we need
I'm 27. I just look old and tired, but I'm 27.
Welcome back to this latest episode of NATO Through Time. I'm Jamie Shea, former NATO official, and once again it's my pleasure to serve as the co-host of this discussion. I'll introduce both our special guest and the theme of today in just a few moments, but first let me welcome back Thomas Pilegovic. He's our younger generation co-host. Thomas, last time you were on with me when we interviewed the former Deputy Secretary General Rose Gottemoeller some time ago, you were working in NATO's Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence, but my spies have informed me that since then you've moved into the government, into an advisory role in the Foreign Ministry. So let me start by not only welcoming you and ask you to say hello to everybody, but to congratulate you on your next significant career step.
Hi, Jamie. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me. I guess the first episode went so well that I got a promotion, So.
Absolutely. Now, dear viewers and listeners, as I mentioned already, and as you know, if you follow us regularly, which I hope you do, our theme has very much been looking backwards and assessing the importance of history and its impact. But we're now in December, almost at the end of the year, almost at the end of NATO's 75th anniversary. So we thought we'd do something a little bit different today, which is turn to the future. A much more difficult exercise, of course, in terms of trying to guess what the future is going to be and how it could be significant for NATO's next 75 years. But we've decided to be very daring because we feel we have the right person. I'm delighted to welcome somebody who I've worked with for many years. I hope I can call you, Florence, a friend. It's Dr Florence Gaub, who is currently the director of the research division at the NATO Defense College in Rome. But Florence has been very much on the sort of think tank conceptual circuit for many years, deputy director of the European Institute for Security Studies for a long period. She's been a foresight advisor to the European Council, and she also serves on the Global Future Council on Complex Risks. That sounds like the ultimate intellectual challenge of the World Economic Forum in Geneva.
I am so pleased to be here, Jamie and Thomas.
Before we even get into anything NATO related, you have a really fascinating line of work. I was wondering maybe you could tell our audience a bit, how does one and what kind of a career does one undertake to enter the profession of reading the future? So what kind of crystal ball do you own? Where did you get one?
So funnily enough, I have a crystal ball. It doesn't work. It was a gift from Bruno Tertre, whom you also know, Jamie. But actually, I think most, if you want futurists or strategic foresighters, they fall into it a little bit like Obelix fell into, the magic potion. I studied political science. I was very much focused on conflict, and then I ended up getting stuck in the Middle East. And it is actually from there, I think it's both conflict and the region that together brought me to the future, because everything related to conflict is ultimately about prevention, right? Because conflict is terrible. And so by nature, research looks into, well, what can we understand about why it happens that helps us not to make it happen? And then, of course, in 2011, the Arab Spring led to people in my field to thinking about, well, why didn't we see this coming? And I think that's really what got me to then thinking more generally, what methodologies are there to try and understand what could happen, might happen, will happen, etc. And then from there, it was a hop and a skip. And then the EU asked me to write the Global Trends Report to 2030. So I think, yes, you can study foresight or futurism if you want. But I think it's a diversity of profiles. So you can study, I would say, almost anything. We have mathematicians, physicians, physicists, sorry, not physicians, although even they might be good at foresight. So I think it's more a personality than something you study.
You are now working as Director of Research at the NATO Defense College in Rome. Could you talk about the process of making a prediction? What kind of factors, shape the way you go about this, and Have you ever gotten a prediction horribly wrong?
Probably, yeah. But
That's putting you on the spot.
Probably, but before I fish out the right one, perhaps I should first explain, if you look at NATO's future ecosystem, there's different organizations, entities that look at different kinds of futures. And so we, as the research division, we look at the future 5 to 10 years from now. The comic that we'll talk about is an exception because it was for the anniversary. You know, we have ACT looking at the long-term future.
That's Allied Command Transformation.
Sorry, yes, thank you. Allied Command Transformation, looking at 20 to 40 years from now. We have here in HQ, we have organizations that look at the more immediate future from the next 6 weeks to next 2 years. And then there's SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. So there's different entities doing different things. So we are in the 5 to 10 year range, and we look at what I call the fringe futures. So the futures that the others are not thinking about. You could say improbable, but that's not a good term because then people immediately don't want to engage with it. And so the way we do it, like for instance, right now we have a series of what-if scenarios. So I run after the analysts. I run after them because they run away from it, because they enjoy it. But it's an intellectually difficult exercise. And I ask them, what in your field do you think is overlooked but could lead to something that could become a problem? And the emphasis is on overlooked. So it's not just about imagination. It's not just like, yeah, maybe aliens will come, or maybe, you know, that's a classic example. Like, no, they have to prove to me that there is a weak signal, what we call a weak signal. There's some evidence that might later on lead to something bigger. And so the funny thing is that when you do this exercise, everybody, me included, will go for the probable thing first. So they will say, invasion of Taiwan, detonation of a nuclear weapon. Because the first thing, it's called the availability bias in psychology. The first thing that comes to your mind is what the last thing basically you heard.
Things you're familiar with.
Exactly. So my role is to tickle them in a way and say, okay, first tell me everything you think is probable. We put that aside, and now let's look at what else is out there. And so it's a process that relies, of course, on collegiality. When I say I run after them, it's not really running, but I have to, you know, kind of squeeze them intellectually, and they as a group have to be diverse, which that luckily they are, diverse in terms of age, background, gender, specialization, et cetera, and then we circle the issue, and then I would say there's a fair bit, 10 to 20% that we throw out, because we realize actually the evidence doesn't add up. There's not enough weak signaling, or it's already been done. So this is how we go about it.
But Florence, starting with the immediate future, I suppose the easier part. You know, we're heading into 2025. I imagine that you ask most people around this building at NATO headquarters, what are you thinking of? Well, the war in Ukraine continues past the third-year mark, despite the current talk about a possible negotiation. Mr. Putin keeps up with all of these nasty hybrid warfare things that we've been seeing in and around Europe recently. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has been warning about the way in which Russia, China, North Korea, Iran working more closely together. Everybody, of course, is thinking about this new administration in the United States. So what's your take on all of that? Is there something else out there that you would want to add to the agenda? And when you do forecasting looking at the immediate future, are you also trying to sort of draw policymakers to opportunities? Look, guys, there may be an opportunity here for you, to turn the tide, as well, of course, of, getting them very depressed about the increasing number of risks and challenges.
So I'll start with the last question, because I think it is fundamental for people in my line of work to not depress our audience, because then they just will not listen to us. And already we're struggling, in the ocean of information that's out there. We also are fighting for attention. So what you want as a futurist or strategic foresighter, I'm just going to say futurist from here on because it's a bit of a debatable term, but is to not just scare them, but give them the keys on what you can do with this. So don't leave them feeling powerless. And that's why when you overwarn, like you drill it home, like something bad's going to happen, and human beings cannot absorb that much negativity. So they will just shut down. It's called the Cassandra complex, that human beings are capable of just ignoring warnings. So you have to give them the feeling of agency. Look, there's a problem here, but here's a potential solution. And of course, like you say, don't just warn. Don't just get into the habit of saying something bad can happen, but also show, look, there's also something good you're overlooking. That could be a potential opportunity. So that's 100% the case. Now, what is lying ahead? I think what's so great about doing foresight for NATO is that NATO, in contrast to the EU, where I used to work before, has a very much narrower mandate. So NATO's future, NATO's thinking about the future is essentially we will deter any type of conflict, anything that harms our security. And if that doesn't happen, then the future is already not so bad. So that makes it a lot easier for us. But at the end of the day, the core business of NATO is not everything that happens around the world. And that's why I think it's also important for us that we narrow things down, that we bring to the attention of our leaders, because they don't have to have situational awareness on everything if there's nothing they can do about them. So, but what I do think about next year is that on the hybrid conflict, on the hybrid methods that Russia uses in particular, I think we're not being imaginative enough. We have to make them concrete. We have to write down scenarios. I would love to do a scenario exercise where we say, okay, let's imagine the 5 most damaging and perhaps also feasible, not so much probable, because, as NATO, we're in the business of improbable anyway, right? War is one of the more improbable things. So let's do the improbable things set aside. But they're feasible and impactful, and then bring them to life so that the audience knows, because that's also our function, is to warn by saying specifically, a fight club in Dresden kills the mayor of Dresden and is clearly funded by Russia, right? And then Germany says that's an attack. According to Article 5, the other allies say, no, we don't think so, because that's the scenario I'm worried about. And then let's flesh it out. Let's make it more concrete, because then when it happens, then we're like, aha, we've already seen this. And that's what foresight does. It creates a memory of the future. It prepares you in that. It reduces response time because you've already thought about this. So I would say let's make these hybrid attacks more concrete so that we can actually make them user-friendly, and then you actually have more of a warning impact.
No, I find it very interesting what you say about increasing sort of domestic instability incidents, hybrid warfare, assassinations or cyber attacks or interfering with critical infrastructure, the things domestically, which most people would consider would not sort of qualify as an Article 5 collective defence case, but actually could sort of evolve in that kind of direction.
And that's the scenario I'm most worried about, because the obvious one, Russia attacks a Baltic state, Russia attacks Poland, we're kind of prepared for that because we've talked about it, we thought about it. But what about all the others that we have not imagined? So the purpose of foresight is also to bring it to life. When it's more concrete, you can start thinking about it. When it's very vague, like hybrid, And then perhaps in addition to that, the other area I'm worried about is the Mediterranean, because we are so busy looking east that, and you know, I'm a Middle East expert, so indeed, yeah. It's kind of my bias, but we have a paper coming out on Russia's activities in the Mediterranean, and my worry is that while we're all busy looking east, they're busy in the south. They're busy not just in the Mediterranean with their ships, but also, you know, around it. We have satellite material that's declassified, so I can say it, but that the Russians have bought a shipyard in Morocco. It's for commercial purposes, but of course we immediately go, okay, well, what else are they going to do with this? So it's things like that, you know, start thinking, this is a weak signal, for instance, right? So the shipyard is a weak signal, and then we start thinking, okay, well, what could they do with this, which then could worry us later.
Of course, you mentioned the threat posed by Russia, both in terms of its very conventional, brutal aggression against Ukraine, but also the hybrid attacks it conducts against NATO allies and other countries. Clearly, Russia is a threat today. How do you kind of view the threat posed by Russia in the medium and long term?
So that's obviously the question that's on everybody's mind. So what we're trying to
which is precisely why we know that you're going to give us an answer.
So we're trying to crack the nut from our end in different ways. One of the things we do is I have a fantastic researcher, Olesya Vinyas de Souza. She's a data geek, which I unfortunately am not yet. She crunches data and looks at things like economics, revenue, all kinds of things you can stack and then figure out, you know, the famous question, how long can Russia actually sustain this war? We think it cannot sustain it for that much longer, but in any case, you know, there's of course the other dimension. Then there's the other dimension of the possible negotiations in the coming year. The other thing we're looking at, of course, is the impact of the war and, of course, the fallout of the Wagner group being withdrawn or being suspended or stopped existing. That also has an impact. And we also have a fantastic publication out by Alessia and by Ulrich Pfister from HQ on cohesion in the Russian military. So we can actually correlate that the way you treat your soldiers has an impact on cohesion, which is something we have seen also in Ukraine, the abandoning of weapons, etc., etc. So the question that you're asking at the end of the day is insofar we have sustainable data to suggest that Russia will be hurt significantly in an economic and military way, but, and this is where data cannot help us, but only imagination and empathy is to understand what does the Russian leadership think about all of this. And we have, unfortunately, no indication whatsoever that the Russian leadership, or in fact the Russian population, think that the trajectory Russia is on is bad. So that means that, we have obviously a capitalist liberal mindset. So we look at the economic and military data and we're like, okay, they're going to run out of fuel, so it's probably over. But a system like that can run on fumes for a significant amount of time. So we're in NATO, so we're trying to prevent the worst. So we also have to assume the worst. And in my reasoning, Russia will continue to pose a threat. If they don't, then that's great. But then I've overwarned, which is better than underwarning.
With an eye toward the longer-term future, what, in your view, are the key trends or developments that NATO allies need to prepare for in the decades ahead? Maybe if you could go to NATO Secretary General and say, these 2 or 3 things we really need to be looking ahead, what would they be?
So I think he's inundated with data on this. But if I had a chance to raise his awareness, it would be number 1, counter-space weapons. So the prospect of a war in space, a war, it doesn't have to be like, I don't know if you've seen the series For All Mankind. Jamie, have you seen this? Okay, I was going to say, for a historian, this is a must, even though it's alternate history, but you have people shooting at each other in space. That's not the kind of space war I'm talking about, but it's more about deliberate destruction of assets, satellites, et cetera. And we know that Russia is working on counter-space weapons, and I think that's something we really need to move a lot faster on. So you have allies that are moving ahead, the US, France, but there are several others that are, just tagging along or not doing enough, I think. So space. And the other thing is everything that's related to maritime. The one thing we found in the comic we're going to talk about later is that almost all authors that contributed to it found that the next conflict will have a maritime dimension. And what we mean by that is underwater sabotage, so cutting of seawater cables. You also have, of course, in the future, the opening of the northern route, so, where China and Russia have access, and so do we. Underwater drones. We talk a lot about drones, air drones, but actually underwater drones are also a coming thing. We know that climate change will change, for instance, how submarines can operate. Nuclear submarines will become significantly faster to detect with rising temperatures, which is obviously a huge issue, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if you have to strengthen our maritime capability, I think that would be my one message. And of course, it goes counter to what we're thinking right now, which is kind of what the future always is, right? The future is never completely different from the present, but what we're worried about or what we're focusing on is what is different. So because of Ukraine, we're looking very much at land war and maybe air war, but we think that we have to do a lot more in maritime. So space and maritime would be the 2 trends where others are already moving, and I think we're not moving fast enough. We're doing some things, but not enough.
As you sort of look forward, you've got these sort of big scenarios which are going relatively quickly, slowly, but are moving ahead, of things that sort of frame the environment in which states and individuals act. You mentioned climate change, of course, and you mentioned earlier societal change, polarization, these kind of scenarios, social cohesion. You've obviously got the tech bit, how we eventually come to live with AI and robotization and autonomous weapon systems and everything. I was listening to a program on the radio driving here about my digital double, who will sort of outlive me as a replica of my good self. You've got obviously the information space and reality perception and all these things. So how do you sort of factor individuals and states and Putin's and Trump's and NATO Secretary Generals as they sort of interact with these ongoing sort of societal trends?
So what's very interesting, I think, about the work that we do is that I think trend analysis is the first step in everything that we do. It's like the homework. We have to look at the longer term trends. We have to look at the data. But then to make it useful, and I think that's the most important thing, because earlier you asked me also about prediction. Well, I'm not sure if I predicted accurately. Is that useful? Or is it useful if actually somebody can do something with that information, right? Because I always use the example of the pandemic. When the pandemic started, all over the internet, people were saying, I saw it coming and nobody was listening to me. So, okay, so they got it right. But did they win Foresighter of the Year? No. You get Foresighter of the Year if you avoided something because somebody was listening to you, because you made your analysis useful to them and actionable. That's always the word I hammer home. It's like it has to be NATO actionable. If NATO can't do anything about it, then let's give that to somebody else. Okay, so that is, I think, the first thing to say. That is why a trend analysis. There is no way the SecGen will plow through a big trend analysis, or the ambassadors, or anybody else who's of strategic level. But what they will read is something that's much shorter, and that is in the shape of a scenario. And a scenario can accommodate individuals. So a scenario is a story, but it's not just a story, it's a linking of causalities. Because I think, what makes foresight good? I think it's two things. One, clear establishment of causality. This links to this, links to this, links to this. That's the biggest issue when I review the what-if scenarios I get, is that are the causalities clear? Does this make sense? The way you can test it is try to tell the story to a little child. If they don't understand how these two links link up, then they just don't link up. So causality and utility. So can they do something with that? And individuals of extraordinary power, I think that's also, how do I put it? Not the blind spot of strategic foresight, but that's the spot that remains a mystery. Is the bigger the human factor in any future, the more complicated it's going to be, because we don't have data. We cannot go and interview Putin. We cannot go and interview Saddam Hussein and figure out, why do leaders take certain decisions in a certain context. So the only tool we have is empathy and imagination. And these are two skills that we have to foster in people. And of course, we're in NATO. We're in a big military political bureaucracy, and you come around and you say, okay, now let's talk about feelings, and imagine that you're somebody else. It does work, but it takes a lot of framing. But we find that the scenarios, the actual stories, that always start with the event. So that catches them, and then they can read it in 7 minutes. And then at the end, the story always ends with the concept, how did we get here? Yeah. That's where they can add.
So you need good analysis, but you have to sort of find the right format so that it makes sense to these busy policymakers who obviously are thinking the crisis of the day, right?
Exactly.
Not the crisis of
and
next
that's
week.
The 21st century, I don't know what the challenges would have been if I'd done this job 20 years ago, but we have to fight for the attention. We have to be clever, and we have to understand who our audience is much, much more than perhaps people in the past. So the delivery with visuals in a short format, be original, in the shape of a comic, that's what's going to get your attention.
As we move ahead, we did say we were going to go all the way up to 2099. Is this really worthwhile to try to forecast over such a large distance? Is it purely, interesting but totally idle intellectual speculation?
In other words, which cryptocurrency should I buy now?
Reasonably speaking, how far forward is it possible or useful to go, where you simply say, no, this is, like the old map, of the Middle Ages, where you fall off the world into nothingness. So where do we sort of fall off the edge of the world into nothingness?
So I brought, I thought I caught you glancing at it. Unfortunately, this is not the comic. I simply forgot to bring the comic. It's available on the website of the NATO Defense College, NATO 299. But this is something else. This came out in 1887, looking backward from 2000 to 1887. The author, Edward Bellamy, was an American. And it's one of the very early works of utopian thinking about the future. And when you read it today, it's surprising because in many ways it's accurate. And this book was one of the first science fiction bestsellers. By the way, I mean, if you're a sci-fi fan out there, you know this, but for those who don't know, science fiction normally is not a bestseller. Like, I mean, there's the odd success like Star Trek and Star Wars. But even Star Trek, when it first came out, was not a success anyway. So why is something like this useful, even though he never saw the year 2000? For policymakers, especially democratic policymakers, they perhaps underestimate that the future is a selling point. People, we see this in surveys, citizens in democracies, they want more future, they want more long-term thinking. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I've just spent 3 days in an American archive looking at how American opinions on the future have evolved. And I have found, amongst other things, that the candidate that comes across as optimistic is consistently the one who wins the elections. And careful, optimism and vision for the future is not the same. Optimism is about agency. So if you want to be elected, I think having a vision and displaying credibly that you know how you can get there, I think that's a democratic selling point. It makes people happy, and most importantly, I mean, this is a moral argument, but I think many people might not, many people that are under pressure might not really buy into it, but almost all policy problems we have today, you will not be able to solve within your mandate anyway, be it climate change, geopolitics, AI, etc., etc. So you have to have, by definition, a long-term outlook and have to be capable of developing a policy that you can pass the baton to the people after you. So I think there's enough reasons to say we can actually think more long-term. Perhaps one last thing, there's a study, an intergenerational solidarity index that was established to figure out which countries in the world are actually, ultimately the question, are dictatorships better at the future than we are? And the answer is, it doesn't depend on the system, it depends actually on the vision. But if in the direct competition between a democratic and a dictatorial leader, democracy will win because that future will always be supported by the majority. So they can go quite a longer distance. So democracies are completely capable of thinking of the future, but they have to make it a priority.
You brought up what sounds like a fascinating project. Could you tell us why you thought this kind of media, this format was the right one? What was your inspiration for that?
So I had two inspirations, and they're all actually three. They're all French, I have to admit. So you obviously, as French people, we kind of claim that science fiction was invented in France with Jules Verne. It's not totally true because it also has some credible origins in the UK, Francis Bacon, etc. But it doesn't matter. So the point is simply that we find in French policymaking a tendency to use creative methods. One was during the French presidency of the EU, they asked authors from all EU countries to write an essay about the EU. It came out as a book, or stories rather than essays. And I thought that was very interesting. How do you capture the voice of a collective entity like NATO? And then, of course, in the French Defense Ministry, they had the concept called l'Arrête Team, which was working with sci-fi authors, imagining all kinds of different futures. It was not very comic heavy. So the comic was really my own idea, but I thought I was very much inspired by this use of science fiction and then getting a voice from every member state. And then I thought, okay, the fastest way to get attention is to do something, to use a format that NATO is not really known for. And that's, of course, the graphic novel. I always say comic, but I've learned the difference now, and my people hate it when I say comic, but people I think that aren't familiar will be more easily connect to comic. So the graphic novel as a format is actually, first of all, becoming more and more popular again, because we are, over Instagrammed and under, classical drawing with a hand. It was an actual person that drew this comic. And of course, comics are set to get us to an audience like yourself, Thomas, people that are under 45 that perhaps have not much of a relationship with NATO, and then it brings it to life. So it's a real story based on the 40 contributions. So it was from every NATO member state plus Switzerland and Ukraine. They also submitted, and I decided to take them on board. And I have to say the response has been incredible. I mean, when I went to see the commandant, the general who runs the NATO Defense College, General Nielsen, and I said, okay, here's an idea. I want to ask science fiction authors from every member state for a contribution what NATO will look like. I didn't know would they all write NATO won't exist anymore. Luckily, nobody did that. And secondly, then I will turn it into a comment.
Highly reassuring.
That is highly reassuring. Yeah, I know. I know that. That's really what you wanted to know. So NATO continues to exist.
It's good to know.
But it will have challenges, and I think that's the most important thing. People, you don't need to have a comfortable present to have a good future. And that's, I think, what people right now, the debate is, oh my God, we cannot imagine a better future because everything is really bad right now. Utopia is born when things are bad. So in that sense, we're in the perfect position to imagine what kind of future we want. So the graphic novel, as I said, available on the website. We have some prints coming out. It's not for sale, but we are in talks with a French publisher who want to produce a prequel that then you can buy in shops.
That's so inspiring. I think you should be my motivational speaker.
Oh.
How good do you think NATO is today at doing this? You mentioned a lot of different areas of NATO. We have an intelligence division now. You've mentioned Allied Command Transformation. Obviously, your own research branch at the NATO Defense College. So there are a lot of sort of elements. But is it all adding up to what you think are the right sort of products that NATO needs to have in terms of your scenarios, your models, your forecasting? You may produce fantastic work, but are you able to get this material onto the agenda of the North Atlantic Council in informal sessions? Are you able to sort of do exercises with the ambassadors where they sort of, or the military committee where they look more into the future? If I could ask you, what's going right and what's not going right, with you're always very frank, which is what I appreciate about you. Where do you think NATO stands? And presumably, you speak to a lot of business leaders and other organisations that do this sort of thing. So, are you able to come up with good sort of best practices and good sort of experience from outside NATO to try to sort of get that into the NATO system?
So I'll start with the good news. It's a lot has changed. I was in NATO, as you know, between 2009 and 2013, and I was in the EU, and then I came back. Compared to my first stint in NATO, it's completely different when it comes to all of this. I would say until 5 years ago, NATO was not really thinking much about the future. That doesn't mean that it didn't have a concept of the future. It had plans and ideas, but there were no real entities. I mean, ACT, Allied Command Transformation, their first report was 2013, Strategic Foresight Analysis. So I would say that that's probably the official turning point. When I first arrived, I threw a network out. I sent a signal out to the NATO universe and said, hello out there, who else is working on the future? And I discovered actually there's lots of entities. And so we met in October for the first time in an informal structure, the NATO Foresight Network, all connecting, saying, okay, what are you working on, etc. So that's great. But there is a lot that remains to be done. What you just described, no, we do not do exercises yet in the political committee, with ambassadors, with the SecGen, etc. We're not there yet. So it's a matter of access. It's a matter of resources. My team is really small, and I'm sure everybody else is saying the same thing. And it's not just that. You need to get training. You need to get training on data, on AI. I'm fighting to get somebody who can actually visualize everything that we do. So there is a lot to be done, but I'm hopeful because I think nobody is disputing the methodology really at the moment. I mean, it's all about user friendliness, but I think ultimately the acceptance rate right now is high. And I think the reception of the comic alone is an indication for that.
So work in progress. So
work in progress, but the direction is the right one.
Okay, well, at least you're there to sort of give it a push. I mean, at the end of the year, people sort of do the reviews of the year and the forecasting for next year. The Economist, the Financial Times, the major media all do their sort of prognosis for next year. And the question always comes up is, what you're seeing at the moment, does it make you very pessimistic for the future of humanity? Or are there nonetheless some things that maybe we don't look at all the time? I don't know, women's education, longevity, human health, human happiness, if we could measure that? Are there sort of certain things that maybe we don't pick up, but which nonetheless could make us a little bit more optimistic? We seem to live in dark times, but is there a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, of course, there's always light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train coming towards us. I think there is plenty of reason to be optimistic. I mean, I am optimistic, and I'll tell you why. Because ultimately, optimism is about a sense of agency. And when I think about all the things that we have, not just in terms, I'm not talking military capabilities only, but, intellectual firepower, a vision, etc. And then, of course, look at history properly. You will see that there's been plenty of times when NATO was talked down, when the West, the first book is The West in Decline, came out in 1918. So there's, I think it's actually more constant, and we always think, oh my God, things will be over soon, and then we somehow get our act together. So I'm optimistic. And, when you look at a lot of things that have gone better in my own lifetime, when I was born, we had, 25% of states in the world were democratic. Homosexuality in Germany was illegal. Rape didn't exist as a crime. Women didn't have the same rights. In the last 20 years, suicide rates have dropped by 25%. Nobody talks about that. And because you mentioned climate change, okay, 1.5 might no longer be feasible, but 1.6 still is. So we shouldn't
everything to play for.
Exactly. So there's still, if you imagine the future as a corridor of possibilities, that corridor is absolutely still there. And I think we should stop whining about it and get our act together and actually make the future what we want it to be.
I really like what you said about not just offering some overwhelming sense of doom and gloom, but also offering some suggestions, some way forward, some solutions as a way of granting agency. So I think that is the key thing to keep in mind when decision makers, when politicians speak to society.
Well, Florence, thanks a million. Absolute intellectual fireworks. Thanks again for coming today.
My pleasure,
and being our guest on the NATO Through Time podcast. Well, Thomas, again, my thanks for also being here today, or at least on the screen, and being my co-host. As I said, that was a very rich conversation, and Florence said an awful lot. It was a real tour de force in terms of taking us through not just, what can NATO expect in the future, but why it should be looking more systematically at forecasting, what the utility can be for diplomats and military leaders. I mean, there was a lot there, but if I had to ask you what the two or three things are that struck you the most, what would they be?
Mm-hmm. I think one really key thing that stayed with me is the point she made about a good forecaster is not just one who conducts trend analysis and builds models, but one who is able to convince the decision maker on a way forward, on concrete steps that need to be taken. And I thought that Florence made a really good point explaining the importance of kind of storytelling, very clearly linking causality and offering the utility of potential solutions to these emerging challenges. One other point I found interesting was she mentioned it more as a future threat, but I think it's already coming to manifest today. The threat of maritime operations, different types of underwater, undersea sabotage of critical infrastructure. I think we're already today in the news seeing how dangerous this is.
I really was interested in the way in which she spoke about sort of domestic developments, which could reach that sort of level of criticality that a country might feel that it was under attack and turn to NATO to declare Article 5. And that's not the kind of scenario traditionally that NATO has been used to. So how would we sort of deal with that and face it? But also obviously use that kind of analysis, forecasting analysis, to try to prevent those kind of domestic crises from happening in the first place. I also like the way in which you said that a good way of getting NATO's attention is to look at what the actors on NATO's radar screen are doing, let's say Russia, but look at different things that they're doing in different places where which could be significant in the future, but which are not analysed so much. I like the idea that she developed, that it's not about predicting, because it's so difficult to predict things, but it's about helping policymakers by doing good scenario work to avoid things while they still can. because precisely they had that kind of analysis presented to them, this kind of early warning, situational awareness building function. But it must be NATO actionable. As Florence said, NATO will face many, many, many challenges. It will still be around. And an uncomfortable situation today does not mean that you don't have a good future tomorrow. That for me was perhaps the most resounding phrase. So, Thomas, thank you very much indeed for joining me today as co-host.
Thank you so much for having me. And again, I'm really glad that we have Florence on our side, on our team, to show us the way ahead.
Yeah, so she would be far too formidable to be on the adversary team, I think, Thomas. I share your view entirely. Dear listeners and viewers, let me just wrap up very briefly by saying that, as always, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope that if it's the first time, it will encourage you to go through the backlog of our previous podcasts on NATO's history. I hope at least you enjoyed our opportunity to look a little bit at the next 75 years as well, because what we can say for certain is that the history will be just as eventful and just as rich, just as impactful and important for the world as it's been over the last 75 years, even if we don't quite know yet what shape it's going to take. Dear viewers and listeners, it's important to study history, as this series of NATO Through Time have tried to point out. We can learn a lot from history. It's provided we understand it and assess it correctly. It's a valuable guide to better analysing the type of situations and the choices we face today. But as we've looked to the future, the last thing that I would like to say as I sort of end the series from NATO headquarters is that for the young generation of viewers and listeners, it's even more important to make history and make good history than simply to study it. And I wish you all great success in making that history. And I wish NATO for its next 75 years as much success as it's had over the last 75. Thomas, I've been honoured to have great co-hosts such as you. As I said, I hope in 75 years somebody pops up who could take us through the next phase of NATO's history. But from NATO headquarters and from all of us, goodbye today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.